stories are so powerful, and how we frame those and not think so much about like how can we take away from people's life, right? Because sometimes we come up with interactions or things that are just so addictive almost.
Hey Hatchlings, welcome to the Motion Hatch podcast. I'm your host, Hayley Akins. Hey Hatchlings, and welcome to episode 61 of the Motion Hatch podcast. This is a podcast where we talk about the business side of motion design and animation. On this week's episode, I spoke with Sharon Harris. She is a senior motion designer at Google. We spoke about how to get into UX motion design, what it's like working in the tech industry as a motion designer, and much more. Just before we get into this episode, I want to remind you about the Freelance Contract Bundle. This is a set of contract templates made specially for motion designers and animators. It includes a freelance terms of service contract for day rate and hourly projects that you do in-house, and a commission contract for direct-to-client work. So if you're interested in checking that out, head over to our website to motionhatch.com/contract. Now let's get into the episode. Hey Sharon, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you're a senior motion designer at Google. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
So I am a motion designer, like you said, in the material design team, but more specifically in the Google design team. What we do there, we have our editorial platform, design.google, where we talk about what's happening in design and technology and kind of the tension there, or how beautifully it's working within Google products. We also do interviews and podcasts, and then we put together an annual design conference called SPAN around the globe. And last year was actually here in my backyard in Brooklyn, New York, where we bring people from outside of Google and Googlers as well to sort of highlight what people are doing in that space as well. So it's kind of like a bit of a more personal, where you can meet people and kind of mingle around people that are doing really interesting things. We have workshops and things. So that's that team. There's another motion designer, Jonas Neymark, in the material design team. So we still like talk and kind of help each other out and different things motion related in the team as well. So I'm kind of on both, but more focused in Google design.
Do you want to tell us a bit about like how you got into tech and UX motion design?
Yeah, it was very, in some ways, random. I was in advertising before tech. So I was working at White & Kennedy for almost 3 years. And a year and a half into it, I started doing my own illustrations and posting them on my Dribble account, just kind of having fun doing that. And around that same time I got married, my husband joined me. I was in Portland, Oregon, had this like personal project he wanted to do. And so he started designing an application for budgeting and like a budget app. And so he started designing a lot of the screens and what that app would do, et cetera. And he was like, why don't you animate these? Like, you should just like animate some of these screens, however you think they would be cool. And I was like, all right. So I animated a few and then posted them on my Dribble account, and I got an email from Google, like a Google recruiter randomly, like referencing some of that work and like, hey, we're interested. Like, we would love to hear if you're interested. And so that's kind of how it happened. I had no experience doing UI animation before up until that point. So it was very surprising. And I remember it was during the holiday season, like right before going on holiday. And I remember just being like, I'm not going to take that job. That's like crazy. Why would I go to Google? Like, what would I do at Google? So anyways, long story short, I ended up taking the job, obviously, and started in the material design team. And from there, at the beginning, a lot of what I was kind of celebrated for almost was like, oh, you come from broadcast and advertising. Like, that's great. Let's have you do, like, John Schlemmer, who wrote the first material motion guidelines, was my manager as well at that time. And he was like, oh, you should make a video animation for this. So we worked on one together. But then right after that, we fully went in UX UI mode and had to like learn and understand what that world was. And soon after that, start literally writing guidelines for it. So it was a very like quick shift in my mind. Like I had to like really do that shift. But yeah, that's kind of how I got started in it. It was very kind of like a random path.
Yeah, that's crazy because I used to
Mm-hmm.
work at Google in London, like as a
Mm-hmm.
vendor for like some of the teams there, like the Creative Lab and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. And I remember when like the material design guidelines came out, I was like, oh my God, like we actually have like stuff that we can go off now. And I can't
Yeah.
believe like how detailed it was with all the
Mm-hmm.
like easy stuff and like explaining
Yeah.
everything in like so much detail.
Totally. Yeah. Well, when I like knew I was going to join the material design team and I looked up like what it was and understood it, I was like, this is so amazing that there's these guidelines, almost like the Disney 12 principles of Disney, right? Of like
Yeah.
understanding how to think about motion, and those principles and foundational understanding was so powerful to your point. So for me, it was also like, oh, yes, I want to be in this team. Sounds great. I don't know what I would do, but
I just think it was really clever to do that. And do you
hmm.
think in the tech industry, I mean, maybe in industries in general, different brands are now thinking more about motion design as part of their branding and how it works and how it works
Yeah.
for them?
For sure. I think that's at least I've noticed, even like when you look around, there's like motion design lead positions for essentially writing guidelines for a brand nowadays. So it's kind of fun to see that it is such a focus for other companies. And for Google, I think it has been since the beginning. And we had a program within the material design team where we would meet with other teams like products at Google and essentially like give them feedback on their work and make sure that they were clarifying any sort of questions they might have. And motion is always at the top. It's like, what do you think? And, we don't have the resources to have a motion designer, but they're a visual designer and they're like, but we're passionate. We know motion adds so much value. So even for them to understand, even as a non-motion designer, it's really powerful because they're advocating for it through the entire process. In my time, at least at Google, I have seen it grown a lot. And even like seeing talks and conferences that are fully motion dedicated in UX conferences and UI, it's really cool.
That's awesome. I want to talk a bit more about that because I think it's still like people don't really know like much about it and they're like, can you be like a motion designer who just does like UX, UI stuff? I mean, like,
Yeah.
do you want to explain a bit more about that and like
Hmm.
maybe how people could get into that area? Because I think it's still kind of a gray
Yeah.
area to a lot of people.
For me, it was entirely, I didn't understand it at all. And coming from advertising where I was touching so many different brands and being able to craft stories for either, one day it was Coca-Cola, the next day was Nike, the next day was Verizon. It was just like such a variety and I loved that. And then going from that, I remember thinking, what am I going to do for one brand for a whole year? So yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends specifically what path you take. So I haven't necessarily worked in a product team proper. So for example, in the search team or the daydream team or anything, like I haven't been in a product specifically. But for material design, my role has been to sort of take a step back and understand what's happening in the industry and what's happening just in general in design and creating a system because everything is interconnected at the end of the day. So it's not like, let's just think about a button, what it looks like, but how does it move? What is that spatial and hierarchical relationship? How does it transform when you tap it? I'm thinking about all of those steps and then specking those animations and kind of understanding the logic behind why we made those decisions. From there, making those guidelines. And I think if, for example, someone gets hired at a company to be in their brand team as a motion lead where you're writing guidelines for the entire company to follow, that's the model, right? You're taking that step back, understanding what's useful, what makes an app useful, reliable, functional, all of those things, and then writing kind of those guidelines, those do's and don'ts for people across the company to follow. But then if you go into a product team, then you're much more involved. There's tighter deadlines, there are features that you're trying to hit quarterly or yearly, et cetera. And so you're working very sort of in focus mode where you work with visual and UX designers to come up with ideas. And then the researchers come in and do user testing of those ideas. And if you did, let's say, 10 different animations and three of them come back as like, these are really interesting, people are really reacting well to them, then you go into building them with the engineers, or potentially going and refining and then showing two, and then choosing just one interaction that feels like the top one and then building it. So it depends. There's a lot of work that goes into being a part of a product team. You're pitching ideas, you're prototyping them, you're working with researchers and sort of reacting to that. And then from there, you're speccing them and sharing them with the engineers. And then sometimes if you use Lottie for an illustration or for an interaction that doesn't require for it to be built by an engineer, that's great. But a lot of times it's a combination of those two. You use Lottie for something, but then you have to essentially collaborate with the engineer to make sure that what you built and designed is implemented exactly how you want it to be. So it doesn't stop at like, this is pretty, here you go. Go and you go and build it. But you have a lot of times there's just so much back and forth to make sure the end product looks high quality, doesn't bug down the system or, the interaction, user testing, even after that. I think I hopefully answered your question, but there's just so many things you can do. It's just an exciting field. There's never a dull moment, I would say. It takes, I think for me, being in advertising, a lot of times, you had the creative director come up with the idea or the art director come up with the idea, the creative director, talk with the client and then come back to the designer. The designer would make things and then the animator at the end would make it move or make it do something special. And so a lot of times, what I missed and what I noticed the difference working in tech versus advertising, which is my specific experience, is that I wasn't necessarily coming up with a lot of the ideas, and like a lot of those ideas that were exciting weren't necessarily mine, where I feel like in tech, I'm able to be much more integrated in that process. And I'm able to potentially come up with the idea or work in collaboration with others to get to a conclusion of something and then test it out. So again, just being embedded in that and thinking differently how to solve those problems that are so technical while still being able to do the designy part of your brain. And so, yeah, I think it's exciting. It's very different, but it's fun.
I was just wondering, do you think that they're UX designers and they're learning motion design, or do you think freelance motion designers are thinking, oh yeah, I'd like to animate some UI stuff and coming in from that direction? Like, where do you see most people who are coming into Google and different tech jobs? Like, how are they getting into that industry?
Some motion designers that I've met that have been only in the UX world, but they're only a handful. Most animators I know have come from freelance work. They were freelancers in different studios. They go into this side of things and do it for a little bit, do it for a year or two, and then go back into freelancing. Or it's, as a freelancer, you can kind of come and go. So you'll have those 2-3 months where you do very UX centric work, and then you go back into freelancing. So I've noticed both. A lot of times I feel like for freelancers, they know how good it is in some ways of doing very exciting work in other studios. So they do Google for a few months and then they go back and forth. But in terms of full-time people, I've seen people that come mostly from studios, other studios, advertising, broadcast, film. Some people that were doing really cool 3D C4D stuff, and now they're working, in Daydream or AR world, and they used to work in films, before that, Hollywood films kind of thing, and now they're doing very technical work, but it's more interactive and in the AR space. So it kind of, I would say the majority just comes from a very different background than you would expect. They weren't doing UX for 10 years before that. Usually it's 10 years of studio and other fun work, and now they're looking for something different and they do tech.
I'm just thinking, if I'm a freelance motion designer or someone who's just getting started in the industry, and I'm I'd like to do that kind of thing, work in tech with UX stuff and things like that. How do you think people could get into that? Is it doing similar stuff to what you did, showing that you can kind of animate this kind of thing? Or
I would say so. Definitely showing work. It's always, every screen will have a UI. I think if you're already interested in that space, showing that you animate UI and UX, and it doesn't have to be following specific, material, systematic sort of foundational work. It can be something fun and different and innovative that we haven't done. And or we haven't seen before. That's the kind of work that a lot of times when we look outside, we're like, that's really cool. And it probably wouldn't work in a UI or it probably wouldn't be accessible or whatever. But it's really interesting. I like how this person thinks. So even showing things that may look crazy or sound crazy to implement, it's good to show work in this field. And that's how people found out about my work at Google. But I think too, like if you have any questions, like emailing people that names that are, in these tech companies, I think that's always a good way to go and just be able to like, hey, how are you doing? I'm interested in this field. Like, what do you recommend I do or look into, or do you know of any opportunities? There's internships that you can do in the summers here at Google. You can come in as a freelancer and kind of have a taste of what that is. So yeah, I would say just a combination of things if you don't have luck with one or another, but definitely just putting yourself out there, like either through the work that you're making or just express your interest to someone, that is doing it in the industry. There's a ton of opportunities for just getting in these companies.
A lot of the time I feel like people find it hard to connect with like some of the bigger companies.
Yeah.
Is there like certain like conferences that like designers in tech go to, or like where can we meet these kind of people? I mean, obviously like I met you at Blend and stuff like that, but do you think like, oh, we all like go to this conference, or you know what I mean? Like, is there anything like that?
I don't know specifically I mean, there's so many conferences, UX conferences. I don't think we all go to just one. I think the one we go is Blend. A lot of motion designers that work at Google, I see them at Blend every 2 years kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know, actually. I don't know exactly where to push people to go to a conference specifically. I know we have a, summer internship that people can do just to get in the door. But in terms of like actually meeting people, conferences in general, like UX conferences, I know there's the Figma conference is coming up, or it's a great space to like meet other that are in the field. And, motion designers are not the only ones hiring motion designers. There's, a design lead that needs a motion designer that you might meet at a conference like the Figma conference or Span conference or Blend conference. There's other people that are looking for motion designers that you can get plugged into and find out more about those opportunities in that way.
Great. So do you think that more motion designers are going to start working in tech companies? Like there's this whole conversation happening at the moment where people are like going there because maybe they pay a bit more money than some of the studios, and like some of the studios are finding hard to like retain the talent and stuff like that. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that kind of thing.
I think so. In general, I feel like the world is moving towards UI screens everywhere and those neat animations, and everything is digitally now. Smaller studios will probably start popping up that are not necessarily a Google, or a Google size or an Apple size, but you're able to do the same similar kind of work, but in a more sort of agency style where, I mean, the perfect example is Hobbs. They do a lot of that more digital facing work with brands like Google, and they're doing really interesting work, but you have the variety of you can work on that or you can work on a different product within the same smaller studio. So you get that feel without having to be in a tech company. But yes, in terms of like bigger companies paying more and that kind of thing, I do think it has moved into that direction. And when I first started at Google, that wasn't my knowledge, at least at that point in my life yet. It wasn't being talked about so much outside of in the industry at that point. And so in some ways now that people know, that may be, a factor that they want to move into these companies because they pay more or the work is different. And, I still think that smaller studios will start doing a lot of like interesting work with companies like this. There's that variety there that you don't have to be in a bigger company just because it feels like the right thing to do or the only option that we all have at this point. But there's other studios that are doing similar work in different and interesting ways.
So you mentioned one studio, was it Hobbs or something?
Yeah.
Is there a lot of studios that are doing more of this kind of stuff popping up?
At least to my knowledge, I haven't noticed that many. I know of Hubs, and then Buck is also, even they're doing
Mm-hmm.
their own work with AR stickers and that sort of creating their own products, which I think that's what's going to start happening. That some of these companies that have been doing it for a while and have sort of that like step forward in that they've been doing it for a while. So they know the technicalities of things and how to tell a story that it's really impactful, while also creating really beautifully and engaging illustrations and experiences that end up being in an AR application or app. So we're going to start probably seeing more of that. I don't know personally that there's like other studios doing it. Yeah, we'll see.
It's always interesting that
Mm-hmm.
because we have all these skills as motion designers, but we don't really make our own content that much or our own
Yeah.
products or things like that. I mean, some people are, but it's like you say, it's quite a small amount.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think that the future of UX motion will be?
I think that's like a tricky question in terms of like just looking into the future. Technology just is moving so fast. And I feel like so many design tools are coming up and there's just so much happening that in some ways it's like hard to predict, like, where we'll get to. I mean, we have AR and we thought VR was like everything. And now we have AR and we're like, this is it. So in some ways, it feels like it just moves so quickly. That one thing I do see sort of anchoring motion and continuing to like for motion to lead in some way is storytelling. So, for example, digital well-being at Google is an effort that Google has put a lot of effort into and is about sort of that technology of humans with that relationship with humans and technology and having that technology not distract us, but actually enhance our lives. They have the digital well-being experiments that Google Creative Lab has done some work for. And one of the experiments is called activity bubbles. When you unlock your Pixel phone, your wallpaper kind of fills in with like these bubbles that fall from the top of the screen. And that shows you how much you've used your phone for that day. So when it starts filling all the way up, you have like that visual kind of connection to what's happening. And same with this other experiment called Anchor by a group of people, but it's the infinite scroll on Instagram where you're just scrolling and scrolling. At a certain point, it starts triggering fish. So it's like if you're in the ocean and you're scrolling all the way to the bottom of the ocean, and then it starts filling up, with water and more fish come. It's like that kind of world that I think it's exciting for motion designers. A lot of us come from a different background where we were fully doing stories or designing beautifully told stories. And I think that's where the world is heading of interaction, where before it was like touch a button and this is what it does, or these transitions should be this way. But I think like motion has the power to say so much more with just smaller interactions and smaller experiences. I see motion designers in some ways advocating for this and using our superpowers of telling a story that because stories move people, right? And I think that's in some ways what I see motion growing into more within tech.
I really like that. I'm like, oh, I want to have that. So you're not like getting distracted by
I know,
Instagram.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. But also, I think we were kind of talking about this on the podcast with Colin and Rosie about VR, all this kind of technology and stuff like that, but it can be used for good things too.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I like the idea that people are now, because we're so aware of like social media being like, distracting us and all of these distractions, but I think we can use it for good, like if you can say that, do you know what I mean? Like people can come up with these things. I guess like Headspace is a great example of that, like a meditation app, and we can like, as technology evolves, maybe there'll be more things where it's helping our lives a bit more, because at the moment sometimes it does feel a bit like we're just sucked in by the internet and we spend all day looking at all screens and we never get outside and stuff like that.
Yeah, which is interesting. I think that's what we've noticed, at least in the past 2 years, we've done SPAN, or the last 2 years. It's a topic that comes up so much within those talks of like, how do we handle that relationship between technology and humans? And again, I think it's stories are so powerful and how we frame those and not think so much about like, how can we take away from people's life, right? Because sometimes we come up with interactions or things that are just so addictive almost, so really like pulling back. And I think that's where research too comes in the picture, and it's exciting what we'll find in the future, just understanding how our behaviors work and how we can design better solutions for that.
I think it's really interesting. And I think that's where like all the sort of UX stuff comes in. Like, it's just, I know that Google has a lot about, they want to like delight the user and stuff like that because of working there for a long time. And I like that side of it. And I think a lot of people are like, how can we disconnect more? But I like the idea that there's going to be more things that are going to help you that are like integrated into these things. Like you're saying about the Instagram thing and stuff like that. Because I mean, it's hard because we're going a bit off on a tangent now, not really about motion design, but you know, it's all interesting. But like how Instagram, we're supposed to be like addicted to it in a way, aren't we? Like that's the whole thing. So what I'm saying is I like to see more people thinking about how can we use technology and like you were saying, our superpowers as motion designers to make our own stuff that could help people maybe.
And just be thoughtful of what the things that we are making and not just think so practical and utilitarian about it. Like, this is what you do. But really take a step back again and kind of, I think too, it's a good practice just to, when you're designing for an application, just to literally take a step back, look at all of your interactions, and can you unify some of those transitions that you have? Maybe there's 3 that are different, but there's 7 that are exactly the same. And that's how you tell that story, right? And that choreography and that architecture for people to understand and know. Once they learn it, it's very easy for them to find those interactions, connecting back to understanding that we're creating for humans and that at the end of the day, we're not just trying to make more money or, but really think about the benefits of these interactions and these designs. And goes back to also to accessibility, being really thoughtful about it and not just design for one set of people, but for everybody. Again, one of the core principles of just working at Google, you will hear it over and over again. It's incredible. I mean, I worked with people that are fully focused on literally writing guidelines for accessibility and talking about it and advocating for it. So it's a big space as well. So anyways, there's a lot of things that, it's all in some ways interconnected. I'm just looking at a material.io. We have an accessibility section under usability where we touch on like color and contrast, layout and typography, writing, imagery, sound and motion, and implementing that accessibility, right? So I think that's a good resource that people can find more about how to design in general, how to think more than just design pieces that you're looking at, but even like sound and those interactions that you're sort of moving through different sequences and imagery. So
cool. We'll put that in the show notes as well so people can have a look at it.
Yeah, perfect.
So what's the one piece of advice that you'd like the audience to take away from this episode?
If you're a designer, motion designer, thinking about doing the transition or starting in the industry and very interested in this, definitely don't be afraid of like, will I be bored at a place, working for one brand or doing this kind of work. It's a very exciting type of work, and you do get to collaborate with a lot of really, really smart people and just do work that is touching so many millions of people. You don't focus on something that is seen for a few seconds and then disappears in a month or 2. This is stuff that is implemented and people use it on every day, sometimes, at least at Google, with the products at Google. So I would say go for it. Like, even if you just want to get a taste, like definitely do it for a time. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from working at the scale that we work here, and kind of learning to, again, just be more inclusive of our design, how we design and how we think about it. So I would say go for it, have fun, and, advocate for good motion design as you move forward wherever you go in the tech world. And again, that storytelling part, how do we care for the designs that we're actually implementing and designing for?
Cool, thanks. So where can people find you and your work?
I don't have a website, but you can find me on Instagram, Sharon Harris, and you can find me on Dribbble as well. Yeah, I think that's about it. Say hi anytime. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Haley.
Thanks again to Sharon for coming on the show. That was really awesome. Are you part of our Facebook community yet? We now have 6,000 motion designers in there discussing their businesses and careers. So if you're not in there, you can join our community at motionhatch.com/community. And I'd love to see you in there. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. See ya.